You're listening to episode 68 of the Confident Writer podcast with Jane Pike. Hello, fabulous human. You know what I find at the start of podcasts is it's really hard not to go full cheese on the approach, which is, I hope all is well. I hope that wherever you find yourself, things are fabulous. And that's genuinely something that I feel. But it's like when it comes out, I'm like, oh, Jane, gosh, that's a bit much, isn't it? But anyway, I do really hope you're well. I hope that wherever you are, things are good in your world. And I am sitting here with a massive cup of coffee. It's a little bit rainy outside. I have a topic very close to my heart that I want to talk about. And before we get into that, I want to tell you that I am doing a workshop, an online workshop, this coming week. By the time you've listened to this, in New Zealand, it's Monday, the 16th of November. If you are in the Northern Hemisphere, it will be on Sunday, the 15th of November. And it's called Touch. It's an experiential workshop where I'm running through body-based practices to help soothe anxiety, to relieve hypervigilance, and to basically give us some resources to come back to ourselves, to come back to center. I'm really excited to do it because it's a topic that I'm really passionate about, and it's also practices that I've drawn on over the entire decade that's been 2020 to make sure that I have my head, heart and body on straight, which is definitely no mean feat. So if you want to join me for that, you can jump on my website, confidentwriter.online, and you will find the links to send you to the workshop. It's not specifically horse-based. It's actually the first offering that I've put out there that doesn't have a direct horse link in the title. However, as you know, my whole approach is life, riding, horses, horsemanship. It's all one and the same. And if we're in a position where we're feeling kind of above ourselves or outside of ourselves, then that's the start point, right? Because if we're taking that to the arena, if we're taking that to the barn, stables or paddock, then it's showing up in ways that are definitely and infinitely palpable to our horses. So I really encourage you, if this is an approach that interests you, come join me. If you can't make it live, totally no problem. You get lifetime access to the recording and potentially other things that I add to it along the way. So definitely worth signing up even if the live option is not available to you. You can also pre-submit questions. So if you sign up, that gives you a chance to tell me what's what, ask what's on your mind, and then I can include it in the workshop itself. So onwards to today's topic. It's related to touch. It's related to our body. It's related to why it is I've really gone down the rabbit hole of approaching things from a body-first methodology. And what occurred to me was that we've never actually really discussed some of the nervous system understandings as to why it's important that we're accessing stress, that we're reconfiguring, that we're integrating things from our past, experiences from our past, traumatic stresses from our past at the level of the body. And I've sat down, I've actually got a whole lot of notes in front of me because it's something that I didn't want to make unclear, basically, or what I did want to do was make sure it was clear. So I'm going to run through it. I'm going to talk about the somatic nervous system today and the interoceptive nervous system and why it is these are really important elements to understand, and to my mind, really exciting elements to understand in terms of why it is the body-based approaches work, why it is the somatic-based approaches work, and some experiences, I guess, that I've been having both with people that I work with and personally that just blow my mind. And maybe that's a really good place to start because I've always been someone that's really responded well or been intuitively drawn to understandings that bring us back to ourselves, meaning that I love approaches which focus, that are very heart-centered, like where it's not just all linear, where we're not just looking at how our thoughts are and what's showing up. And even though I've potentially used these terms in the past, now they make me a little bit sick in my mouth, which is like mental toughness, like pushing through, mental strength. And I get what is meant by those terms. Like, I understand what is the motivation behind using them. However, there's a lack of gentleness, a lack of kindness, a lack of softness that, to my mind, needs to be equally brought in when we're approaching any kind of reclamation or reparation. And what I mean by that is, if we feel like we need to push through something, there's a challenge with what's presenting, right? Like something's happening in our present moment that we feel like we need to deal to or deal with in some way. And the idea of toughness is a very single-minded approach of kind of like bowling forward with a certain level of tenacity that doesn't simultaneously bring to mind this idea of kindness. And kindness and gentleness are superpowers and massive strengths. And the position that I'm starting from now is the understanding that actually to be able to meet yourself with kindness, to be able to return to yourself, is the highest form of practice. Because often when we get outside of ourselves, when we move into a fight-flight response, of course, or when we're finding ourselves in a loop or a pre-patterned reaction that's visiting us time and time again in response to something that's happening, we lose that self-compassion. That usually is the first thing to go. And we berate ourselves or we beat ourselves up about a situation that's already causing some form of distress or harm or unease. And we exacerbate that response because, of course, when we're having conversations with the itty-bitty shitty committee, when we are beating ourselves up in that way, then we are activating those same fight-flight reflexes, but now the war is inside us. So we add fuel to something that we're trying to actually calm down. So this idea of kindness, of meeting yourself with kindness, not kindness as like an insipid practice of denial of what's going on or as a way of bypassing what's going on. And we see a lot of spiritual bypassing online, where it's like the idea of forgiveness, the idea of non-judgment can be used in really inappropriate ways, I believe, by denying someone's experience and suggesting that always approaching situations with a degree of kind of passivity is the best approach. And I don't always think that is the case. Something else that's popped into my mind that I may or may not bring up in this particular session, but I wrote a Facebook post about it. Well, here it goes. It's obviously coming up in this session where when we talk about nervous system regulation or a healthy and robust nervous system, what we're talking about is the ability to activate an appropriate response for the moment. And appropriate is not always calm. It's not always zen. We want to be able to return to that place when when activation isn't required, when some form of mobilization isn't required. However, our response needs to be adequate for what it is that we're being presented with, meaning that if we need to move away from something and occupy the flight channel, we're able to do that. We still have the ability to move our body in the midst of that stress. If we need to defend ourselves or use our voice to say something doesn't work for us or protect ourselves or move towards something in some way, so a healthy association with the fight response, we're able to do that also. And then in the absence of anything that requires us to do either of those things, we're able to come back to a settled baseline where we can return to ourselves. And what I noticed is that, or what I've noticed over a period of time and also through self-observation, is that we're typically trained out of the fight response especially because the modus operandi that many of us have been taught is that in the face of opposition or in the face of criticism or even in the face of someone doing you wrong, just leave it, just walk away, don't give it energy, and so on and so forth. And that can absolutely be the right thing to do. Maybe the majority of times that is the right thing to do. However, what that does, if that is the response to every kind of confrontational energy that comes up, then what we don't develop is the ability to actually say, hold on a minute, this situation requires me to stand my ground. This situation requires me to actually meet what it is that's coming at me and say, not okay, not going to happen. This is where this energy meets mine, and that's the end of this situation. But we're often not taught to do that, which means that reflexively, in the face of that energy, that kind of confrontational energy, we habitually move into a flight response or a freeze response, meaning that we don't say anything, we don't do anything, or we just get out of there. And that can show up in lots of ways, like online, deleting a comment, or not really holding your power or not holding your own. And I think we need to be mindful of the fact that there is a difference between choosing not to act and habitually not acting because you've defaulted to a flight response, because the feeling of holding your own power and actually meeting an oppositional energy is too much for you. And those are very different things. And I've noticed that I have these, especially kind of like a freeze response, and then that a flight response follows that, only in some situations. Like, I've done a lot of work around this, but I especially noticed it last week in a very specific personal situation where I disagreed with something, and I, there was validity around why I felt that way, but my response was to kind of scuttle, to freeze and scuttle. And when I recognized that was what was happening for me, I really dissected where the roots of that came from, which was, don't cause a hassle, don't be confrontational, don't ruffle anyone's feathers, and actually that was out of alignment with what ultimately I wanted to do in that moment. So had I chosen to not engage, that would have been different to the energy of the moment propelling me into non-engagement. So it was a great learning for me, and a great reparation, I guess, of understanding that, like, if I can stay with this energy, there's a completion of that cycle. There is a healing that comes in response to that. And it also means that the energy that is contesting me is not just left out there. That I've actually met that and dealt with that in whatever way was appropriate for the moment. And that's allowed me to move to a different space. I can hold my ground and my center long enough for that to be a transformative experience, and to recognize the mercurial nature of that experience, as opposed to fleeing from it and giving it a sense of fixedness or giving it a sense of permanency as a consequence. Because every time we feel the need to run as a habitual response, we're running from something which in our minds, like I said, creates a sense of fixedness on that experience, when actually if you can stand in the midst of it, you realize that it passes, that it becomes something else. And that's where being able to hold your ground and your center is so important. So the beauty of the work that I've been doing now, to my mind, is that, and to my body, is that I see this alchemy, instant alchemy happening when people connect to how a sensation or how an experience is showing up in their body, and how that information is being relayed posturally, how that information is being relayed in terms of where that sensation or feeling is sitting, and how, when we make adjustments to how that feeling state is being held, that the body changes shape around it. So it's kind of a different idea of what was initially put forward as something that was super popular, especially in the early 2000s, potentially in the 90s, of this idea of holding power poses. And this has since been proved or disproved or debunked as a thing. But basically the idea was that if you hold a power pose for a period of time, that would change the way that you feel. And actually, that's not the case. That's been shown to be not true, because what happens is actually the feeling state is what the body takes shape around. And if we're not addressing the feeling state as one of the first places of beginning, I guess, that's a terrible sentence, but hopefully you get what I mean. If we're not addressing the internal state of the body, that's a better way of describing it, then the shape of the body is only going to be very temporarily changed because the body is taking shape around the feeling. So, where is this leading us? What I want to talk about is the somatic nervous system, the relationship to the interoceptive and proprioceptive nervous system, and why working with those two things is so important when it comes to changing behaviors, when it comes to integrating encoded traumatic experiences, and how it is we can create new understandings and new experiences in the face of that by working at that level. So the conversation needs to begin at the level of memory. And when we talk about memory, there are two categories which are quite important or very important to our understanding of memory. And that is explicit memory or declarative memory and implicit memory. And I'm going to tell you a little bit as to my understanding of both of these things. And I will add a disclaimer here to say I'm not a neuroscientist, obviously, but this work is so important to me that I've done a lot of study in this area myself, and this is my understanding based on those studies. So explicit memory is very much language-based, and it is comprised of facts, of concepts, of very specific ideas. So when something happens, when we do something with our body, our explicit memory is what allows us to think consciously and to describe that with words, okay? So that is where we are learning something in the first instance, or when we're learning something in the first instance. Our cognitive appreciation of that, our conscious understanding of that, is what is committing that experience to our explicit memory, right? So if we're learning to mount a horse in the first instance, or even learning to rise to the trot, there's a very specific set of instructions that are somewhat linear about how it is we go about doing that thing, right? And then if we were to teach someone how to do that thing, it's our explicit memory that actually allows us to put words to the experience to tell someone what it is they need to do to be able to follow through on that task. So if I was learning to mount my horse for the first time, to get on my horse, I might be like, okay, so I line up at my horse's side, I slightly angle my body towards the saddle, I'll place one foot in the stirrup and then I'll bounce off the back foot and then I'll launch up and, so on and so forth. And over time, that procedural understanding becomes embedded in what is implicit memory. So implicit memory is different in that it bypasses language and involves internal states and procedures that are automatic. So after a while, like riding a bike, like rising or posting to the trot, you're not constantly telling yourself how to do that thing. You are automatically doing that thing, and the reason that you can automatically do that thing is because of implicit memory, okay? So explicit memory is language-based. It is comprised of facts, concepts, and ideas. And when we are describing something or thinking consciously about something, we are using our explicit memory in that instance. Now, explicit memory is also really interesting because it allows us to place proper placement of an event in a situation. One of its governing bodies is the hippocampus, which is the part of our brain that timestamps memory. That means that if something happened to me yesterday, it's the hippocampus and my explicit memory recall that allows me to understand that that thing happened yesterday, right? There's a context in my memory bank that tells me when that situation happened. That's explicit memory. Now, Implicit memory, like I said, bypasses language. So we don't have words for implicit memory, but we have feelings and internal states that are automatic or that automatically allow us to follow through on a particular activity. Now, traumatic events and traumatic stresses, things that are unresolved, are more easily recorded in implicit memory because the amygdala, the part of our brain that is primarily in control of implicit memory, is not affected by stress hormones that suppress the hippocampus. Okay, so I'm going to break this down for you. If we have explicit memory and the main governing body, if we think of it like that, this is not strictly correct to say, but just in terms of our understanding, explicit memory, one of the main governing bodies in explicit memory is the hippocampus. What we understand about the hippocampus is it timestamps memory, which allows us to give context to experience in terms of time and space. Implicit memory is governed by the amygdala. It's more feeling-based. It is not language-oriented. And under stress, the stress hormones dampen or suppress the hippocampus and do not have the same effect on the amygdala, meaning that traumatic stress then can be stored at the level of implicit memory and disconnected to explicit memory. And this linking or lack of linking between implicit and explicit memory, I hope you're following along, can be problematic, right? It can be problematic because when we have an experience, a feeling-based experience, or a sensation-based, a body-based experience linked to traumatic stress, it lacks context often, right? We don't understand necessarily why it is we're feeling that way. And that lack of context means that we return to the feelings that we've had in traumatic situations as if they're happening in the present moment, even if they are actually not true for that moment. So let me give you a horse-based example, and this is one that we've returned to time and time again. So let's say I'm standing in front of my horse and he is completely calm, everything is well in his world. If I was to look at him through a balanced lens, I would say now is a great time to ride. However, I might find myself overcome with the feeling of anxiety, right? Now, I understand on a conscious level that feeling is not true or not appropriate, quote unquote, for the moment. However, this implicit memory feeling has surfaced in my body and it is decontextualized from my ability to recognize why and where this experience may have come from. Okay? So in some cases, when we find ourselves in the midst of upsetting emotions or confusing behaviors or impulses, these can exist at the level of implicit memory without us being able to access information as to why they've arisen or what they're about. Okay? It's an important understanding that's a very grassroots explanation, but it's just to show you that at the level of memory, we have explicit memory connected to language. It is declarative. It is what allows us to contextualize events as they've occurred in the past. Implicit memory, not linked to language, automated, exists at a feeling and sensation-based level. And when there is a disconnect between explicit and implicit memory, meaning that why I feel something is not connected to an understanding, a conscious understanding of why that is happening, then that can be very upsetting and disturbing because that is basically kind of the nature of traumatic stress. I think it's going to get a little bit easier from here on in, but hopefully there's something in there that allows you to follow along with what it is that I'm saying. Then we talk about the somatic nervous system, right? So the somatic nervous system is responsible for voluntary movement, and it's responsible through the contraction of our skeletal muscles. Now, this is really relevant to understanding how we can make sense of events that have been encoded or stored in our implicit memory through our understanding or encoding of posture and movement. So when a muscle contracts, one thing that's important to understand is that the only thing a muscle can do is contract, right? And it contracts when it receives an impulse from the nerve that serves it or that it's connected to. So impulses for contraction of visceral muscles, of smooth muscles of the organs, are transmitted through the autonomic nervous system. And impulses for contraction of skeletal muscles are carried through the somatic nervous system. If we understand that the only thing that a muscle can do is contract, then we can recognize that relaxation is actually a passive state. It's not an active state. Relaxation is the absence of a neural impulse. It's non-contraction. Okay? The only thing a muscle can do is contract. So the somatic nervous system, this is what is in charge of behaviors, movements, and procedures that are performed by the body through muscular contraction. So as a muscle contracts in our body, that is the somatic nervous system that is doing so. And then it is our intraceptive or our proprioceptive nervous system that allows us to perceive that feeling or what's happening there. So our somatic nervous system is what is in charge of the contraction being performed, of behaviors, movements, and procedures being performed in our body. And it's our interoceptive, proprioceptive nervous system that allows us to perceive that happening. Okay? The somatic nervous system causes the movement. The interoceptive and proprioceptive nervous system perceives the movement. Now, why is this important? For a new movement or behavior or procedure to be committed to memory or to be maintained in our memory, our proprioceptive nerves and our somatic nervous system, right? So this is information coming from muscles, tendons, fascia, is sending all of that information to the brain via the afferent nerves. Okay, so afferent nerves starting with an A are sending information from the body to the brain. So for an old procedure, movement or behavior to be recalled, that same scheme, that same schemata that actually committed that initial understanding to memory needs to be reactivated and sent out to the body, losing my voice, I've got excited, via efferent nerves. And efferent nerves start with an E, they're like exiting the brain. So the brain is sending information to the body, okay? So when a new behavior is learned, there can also be images associated with that experience. So as we learn a new behavior or have a new understanding, it is stored at a variety of levels and the information is gathered at a variety of levels. And our ability to commit that to memory is based on our somatic nervous system, so where our body, behavior, and procedures are living at that moment, through our perception of what is happening in our somatic nervous system. So what is happening in our interoceptive nervous system, what is happening in our proprioceptive nervous system. And those two things need to be stored simultaneously. So when we undergo trauma of some sort, or when there is a threat that we need to respond to, it is the somatic nervous system that carries out the trauma defenses of fight, flight, or freeze, right? And it does that through the activation of both simple and very complex combinations of muscle contractions. So like to either get us out of there, to mobilize the fight response, or to allow us to shut down if it deems that to be appropriate in that moment. And it does that in cooperation with the proprioceptive and interoceptive nervous system. So both of these nervous systems, the somatic nervous system and the proprioceptive, interoceptive nervous system, have a part to play, a very important part in encoding traumatic experiences in the brain, because they are what are in charge of actually mobilizing our body in defense or in response to stresses. So then if we think back about the fact that when we are in a fight, flight, freeze response, the hippocampus is actually suppressed by the stress hormones, meaning that we can't make conscious sense of it necessarily. It is not being stored in our explicit memory. Then in order for us to reconcile those experiences, we have to work at the level of implicit memory and seek to reconnect the body experiences that we're having, the experiences of the somatic, proprioceptive and intraceptive nervous system with some kind of conscious understanding so that we can reconcile the experience and integrate it, so we can make sense of it. So somatic memory recall can occur when these behaviours are replicated purposely, inadvertently. So when we have that experience, like I said, of standing in front of our horses and feeling a wave of anxiety, and again, you can kind of like superimpose any personal situation into this that you want, but that is a somatic memory. That is somatic memory recall, yeah? The way that your body is holding itself, the shape that it's taking around a certain feeling is causing a memory recall that has triggered a schemata, or a schemata is kind of the fancy word for process that has triggered the feelings in your mind or in your brain, yeah? So the way for us to reconcile that is then to work at the level of the body and to say, how is it that we can change the way that the somatic nervous system and the interoceptive and proprioceptive nervous system are responding in that moment, so that we can recontextualize it with the present and start to link up these associations between our conscious understanding and what it is that's happening at the level of the body and at the level of feeling. It's probably kind of heavy, but I'm hoping that I wasn't too unclear in those understandings. But if we were to summarize it, we would say that in order for a traumatic experience to be encoded in the brain, the somatic nervous system, so the way that our muscles are holding it themselves, and our proprioceptive, interoceptive understanding of that same event, so our perception of that same event, is what is essentially encoding that experience in our brain. And when we go back to a similar posture or a similar feeling state, that can cause us to recall memory patterns from the past, which appear to have no context in the present. However, because our hippocampus has been suppressed, we can't make sense of them. So when we go back to either purposely recreate those experiences or inadvertently find ourselves recreating those experiences, we need to have an understanding of how it is we can repattern and reprogram ourselves or resource ourselves at the level of the somatic nervous system, at the level of the body, and at the level of the interoceptive or proprioceptive nervous system, so that we can actually recode or reinstall some different understandings that allow those decontextualized memories to make sense. So it's a really fascinating system. We are so clever. Our body is so clever. And when you dive into it, for me, what's happened in many instances is that I'm having these experiences and I'm experiencing these results both personally and professionally. And the understandings as to why that is happening afterwards. Like, oh, okay, I get why that's a thing. And for me, really diving into implicit memory, explicit memory, understanding the different procedures and how and why we're storing things in our brain actually makes sense as to why working posturally, working with touch, working at the level of feeling and sensation is so important, and how that is actually recalibrating and creating these connections in our brain that existed in a different way previously. Fascinating. I hope I haven't added more confusion rather than clarity. But it's, like I said, this is my understanding. This is based on my reading and research and deep diving, and perhaps I will develop, or the hope is that I will develop more succinct and clear ways of communicating this. But it felt like something that I wanted to get out there, because you don't hear many conversations around explicitly why that is the case. And when you understand that working at the level of the body is so integral, because you're then accessing the somatic nervous system, you're accessing this interoceptive and proprioceptive nervous system, and those two things in combination are what create memory or a very specific part of our memory that is linked to traumatic stress, you can see how the recalibration is not just like a nice thing to do or like a comforting thing to do, but a necessary thing to do, that we need to work at that level as well as the level of the mind in order to really integrate and make sense of things which may have previously caused us some wobbles. Interesting stuff, huh? Once again, if you want to join me for that touch workshop that I mentioned at the start of the session, jump on my website, confidentwriter.online. We are dealing with this in very practical ways in Joyride. I think my somewhat potentially convoluted explanation over this podcast may make you think, oh my goodness, is it all going to be this heavy? But no, it's very experiential. But I think that understanding the reasons behind why things work is important and a fascinating one. And like I say, part of my process of getting more articulate and deeper understandings of what's going on is to explain them so that they lodge in my brain space and in my heart in much more tangible ways. All right, team, I hope that was useful to you in some way. I'm looking forward to hanging out with you again soon, and I'll catch you on the flip side.